بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم وبعد. Alhamdulillah, this is part 2 of our discussion on the next virtue, the virtue of Zuhud. And we mentioned last night that very often the word Zuhud is translated as asceticism or otherworldliness, renunciation, or detachment from the dunya, the lower world. And we said that this is a very widely misunderstood virtue. And we spoke about the classical meaning of zuhud as given by the scholars. And tonight, inshallah, we want to take a look at how we can apply zuhud for the everyday person today in the modern world. So we have these words for zuhud: asceticism, otherworldliness, renunciation, detachment, and so on. And these words are all correct. It's a correct translation to render those zuhud as these things. However, I'd like to suggest some other translations. So instead of saying asceticism, I would suggest that zuhud is better rendered as non-attachment to the dunya, self-discipline, and non-materialism. Especially this last one, non-materialism, I do believe is probably the most accurate translation for zuhud, given the meaning that we're explaining. Because a lot of times when people hear zuhud, as we said, they think of someone in shabby clothes, someone who is poor, someone who is denying themselves of the pleasures of this life. And that may or may not be an accurate representation of who is zahid, truly ascetic or non-materialist. Now, these are all translations, and translation is inevitably an interpretation. If you take a word in the original language and you translate it into the target language, that does involve some form of interpretation. So if we translate a term a certain way, it does shape how we understand it. If we say zuhud is asceticism, it automatically associates this virtue of zuhud with someone who is ascetic. An ascetic is someone who doesn't really have much of the world. They don't engage in dunya. And if a person is hearing zuhud translated as asceticism, they may think that it as a virtue is only attainable if they give up the dunya. And if we center zuhud with this meaning, we're still centering it on the outward, what it looks like outwardly when a person is quote unquote zahid. And we lose focus on the inner quality of zuhud. We said last night that zuhud is not really an external quality, it is an internal state of the heart. So let us think of zuhud, instead of asceticism, let us think of zuhud as the opposite of materialism. So you hear this word materialism, what do you think? So-and-so is a materialist, so-and-so is not a materialist. Well, what does materialism actually mean? There's 3 basic meanings for materialism, 2 of which are kufr, disbelief, and 1 of which is not. So the first meaning of materialism is the theory that physical matter, the things of the world, is the only reality, meaning the only thing that is real is that which can be measured, that which can be quantified, that only things are ultimately real. So this can include a thought, a feeling, emotions. If they're all explained in terms of physical functions, this is a kind of scientific materialism. Can a Muslim be this kind of materialist? No, you can't. Because we believe that there are realities that are not physical, that are not rooted in the material. So to believe in this kind of materialism is kufr, is disbelief. To believe that the only things that are real are the physical things. That denies the ghaib, that denies the unseen realities, that anthropomorphizes God and other sorts of problems. Another meaning for materialism is the theory that physical well-being and worldly possessions constitute the greatest possible good and the highest value in life. Having the stuff of the world and having physical well-being represents the highest possible good that you can strive for. Can a Muslim be that kind of materialist? No. As a Muslim, you can't, because a Muslim may act in the world as if the dunya is all that matters, but inwardly they cannot believe that the dunya is all that matters. They can't believe that the material world is the highest value to aspire to, because we know that the dunya is fading and that the highest value is the pleasure of Allah Ta'ala. So a Muslim, by definition, cannot be that kind of materialist. The third meaning of materialism is concern for possessions or material wealth or physical comfort, especially when it's to the exclusion of spiritual or intellectual pursuits. Can a Muslim be that kind of materialist? Absolutely. Does this describe the reality of many of us? Yes. We know that the hereafter is more important and more lasting. We acknowledge that physical reality is just one part of reality, and that truth is not simply reduced to the physical. However, many people live as if material wealth and physical comfort is their most pressing concern. That's materialism in a nutshell. So the zuhud we're talking about as a virtue to cultivate is really the opposite of this third one. So number 3, we said, is this concern for material possessions and physical comfort to the exclusion of the intellectual and to the exclusion of the spiritual pursuits. So this is basically zuhud as non-materialism. That means zuhud is about focusing on the hereafter and using the world as a means to that end, without attachment to that means. So the dunya is a means to the hereafter. The hadith says that it is the matiyatul mu'min, it is the riding mount of the believer. It is the means of journeying to the hereafter. It's not an end in and of itself. So zuhud is a key for attaining qana'ah, for contentment and having inner peace. A heart that is lacking zuhud is always going to be craving more and more and more, while the heart of the true zahid will have qana'ah, contentment. So this is basically how we want to frame zuhud, as the opposite of this materialism. Now zuhud itself, like sabr and shukr and other virtues, it has levels, and the ulama mention that of these levels of zuhud you have the bare minimum, which is zuhud from the haram. So zuhud is basically being disinclined to the things of the world. So being disinclined to the haram things of the world is obligatory for every Muslim. Then you have zuhud from things that are makruh, disliked, to be disinclined to the things that are offensive, not outright haram, but they are offensive and they're not praiseworthy. And that can include things like wasting time, overeating, oversleeping, bad manners, and things like that. So these things create a barrier. If we are staying away from the makruhat, by doing so, we create a barrier between us and the haram. Much like how praying the sunan prayers creates a barrier between us and neglecting the 5 daily fard prayers. If you're always praying your sunnahs and you're diligent about that, how likely is it for you to miss your 5 obligatory prayers? It's going to be a lot harder than if you only pray your 5 as a bare minimum. Same thing between the makruh and the haram. If you're abstaining from the haram, if you're abstaining from the makruhat, the disliked things, you're having zuhud from the makruhat, it makes it easier to stay away from the haram. Because if you are diligent in avoiding even those things, you will be even more diligent in staying away from the haram. The next level of zuhud, they say, is zuhud from the shubuhat, or the doubtful matters. These things are not haram, they're not even makruh, but they're a gray zone. It's not 100% clear. It's questionable. So if a person has zuhud from the doubtful matters, they will safeguard their deen. And then lastly, you have the zuhud from the superfluous halal, right? The halal that is beyond your needs, right? This is another level of zuhud, which entails leaving things that are halal that are distracting, leaving things that are permissible so you can focus on things that take a higher priority, that are more important. So, for example, this level of zuhud, of leaving the halal that may take you away from things that are more important, would include things like, okay, you choose to study your deen or memorize the Quran or to read a book over watching something that's otherwise permissible, watching a football game or something that is on the surface permissible, but it's not going to be as beneficial as something else you can be doing. So you have zuhud from that thing in order to focus more on something that's really important. So zuhud, we say, is the opposite of materialism here, not asceticism, where you're wearing shabby clothes and you have disheveled hair. We're talking about the heart being non-attached to the dunya and the material. And this means that materialism is the opposite of zuhud. Now look at the culture around us, not just here in North America, but everywhere in the world. We are in the anti-zuhud culture all over the world. The monoculture is a culture of crass materialism. Everything around us in the culture, media, modern schooling, everything, it's all pushing materialism as the highest ideal to strive for. They believe that having the material goods of the world is the highest goal. It is the greatest good to strive for. So in the materialistic society, they weaponize what is now the greatest commodity. What is the greatest commodity today? It is attention. So they weaponize our attention span, they weaponize our natural desires and manipulate them until they get us addicted to stimuli, and this pulls us away from things that are more important. Now, when materialism becomes the dominant ethos in our lives, we're actually going to suffer from so many problems. When a person's highest value is the material, they suffer from lots of problems, such as obsessive craving after the newest gadget, the newest thing, the newest article of clothing, the newest this, the newest that. There are no longer thoughts about the afterlife as one's ultimate purpose. It's just about fulfilling that craving and getting that dopamine rush when they're shopping for that newest thing to order, right? It also creates discontent. When a person is engrossed in the material and lacking zuhud, they become restless, they're discontent, there's always more to acquire, and no matter how much they get, they're never going to be fulfilled and happy by that material. Likewise, if you have materialism as your ethos, you will eventually begin to fear poverty, and this is what shaitan threatens people with. Allah Ta'ala mentions that in the Quran, that He promises you poverty. So the person in their life, the greatest fear or the greatest evil in their mind is to not get what they want, to lose their wealth, and not to lose their iman. So the greatest fear is no longer losing iman, the greatest fear is losing out in the material. So this in turn makes the person stingy and greedy, and they crave and covet what other people have. It can lead to jealousy and envy and all sorts of evils because they are attached to the dunya and living in the materialist paradigm. Another evil of materialism is getting into excessive debt, because the person who is a materialist is so craving after the stuff of the world that if they don't have the money to get what they want, they will often go into debt. And then they become stressed about this massive debt that keeps growing to fulfill their needs. Then there comes jealousy and envy. They look to what other people have. They look at what they don't have. They become jealous and ungrateful for what they do have. Then they suffer anxiety and depression because they're lacking in the material. And lastly, when the person is lacking in zuhud, they become basically, what the youth call the NPC, or the non-player character. So their materialism pushes them to follow always the current thing, the fashions, the expectations, and the norms of society, because they have to keep up the appearances. They have to keep up with the ever-evolving fashions and changes of what is hip and what is in style, and this is going to affect their purpose and even their very identity. These are just some of the afat, or the ill effects of materialism when it takes root in the heart. So that brings us to the question, if we know what zuhud is as the opposite of materialism, how do we acquire real zuhud that's not just playing the part or looking the part in our outward appearance? How do we have the inner state of the heart called zuhud, or non-materialism? The ulama mentioned that to acquire zuhud, you have to reconnect with your purpose. What is truly important? What is truly important? To know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to know His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to know your deen, to know the reality of this world, to know these realities as described in the Quran and in the Sunnah, and to understand that this is a very temporary place we're in right now, and this is not forever, and we should not live our lives as if this is all there is. Likewise, to cultivate zuhud, you have to cultivate shukr, that we spoke about a few days ago, gratitude, because when you have gratitude for what you have, you're no longer craving as much as you may have been for more and more material goods. You develop zuhud through shukr. Likewise, you look to those who have less than you. You become more appreciative for what you have, and you stop feeling like you're always lacking. People will feel that they're lacking when they compare themselves to others who have more than them in the dunya. If you're always going on Instagram or this and that and seeing all the fancy things that people have, you always feel, oh, I'm lacking. Compare yourself instead to someone who has nothing, not even running water. And you'll realize, wait a minute, I actually have a lot of dunya. I have enough, alhamdulillah. Likewise, to develop zuhud, you have to develop discipline. And by this I mean delayed gratification. Developing discipline is developing delayed gratification and fortitude. With that discipline, you go into the world with a predetermined plan of how you're going to engage in the world. It is measured and it is useful, and your engagement with the world is not based solely on instant gratification, not for that next dopamine rush and gathering the stuff of the world. So this requires fortitude and discipline for delayed gratification. And lastly, to develop zuhud as a positive spiritual virtue, a quality of the heart, we have to live the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in the hadith of Sayyidina Ibn Umar radiallahu anhuma, when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam told him, "Kun fi dunya ka'annaka gharib aw abiru sabil." Be in the world as though you are a stranger or a traveler, a wayfarer. Be in the world like this. This means that we have to understand that we as Muslims who believe in La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah are fundamentally strangers to the dunya. That is the reality. And that's something we have to understand. We have to live our lives as if we truly believe that we are strangers to the dunya. Not in the negative sense, but we are strangers to the dunya, to the negative aspect of dunya, and we are at odds with shaitan and the minions of shaitan, and we know that shaitan and his minions use certain weapons to inflate the human desires and entice human beings away from the path of Allah's pleasure. So this means we have to renegotiate how we are with consumerism. We have to reconsider how we are in the world. It does not mean you have to throw out all your nice clothes and all your nice shoes and all of these things, but it means we have to renegotiate and reconsider how we consume in the world. We have to beware of falling for artificially created desires. There are desires that are cultivated through media that human beings don't actually need, but they become like needs because they're made to seem like they're needs. We have to be mindful of how these games work. We also have to be very aware of the advertising industry, because that is the weapon for creating these desires and stirring the desires of the self to crave more and have more. It is, the science of advertising is a fully developed science using human psychology against human beings themselves to create these desires and get them to spend money. And that is very detrimental to cultivating zuhud. And lastly, to cultivate zuhud as a spiritual virtue, we have to keep good company. And we keep coming back to that point time and time again. For so many of these virtues, one of the key ways of cultivating them is not to do it alone, but to actually look for good companions who will pull you into that positive direction, to have good suhbah. What do I mean? If all of your friends are chasing after dunya, where dunya is the highest value in their life, guess what's going to happen to you? You're going to have the same value system as they do, because you will be the average of the 5 or 6 people you hang around with the most. So if that's their ultimate aim, that's eventually going to become your ultimate aim as well. If they treat dunya as priority number 1, hereafter will be priority number 2, if not 3 or 4 in their hierarchy. On the other hand, if you spend time with good companions who negotiate their interaction with the material world, the dunya, and they use it as a means to an end, to the hereafter, that will influence you, that will shape you and how you relate to the dunya as well. If you are around the abna'ud dunya, the children of the dunya, you, as the ulama say, you will be a speck in their eyes, meaning the dunya is going to be more important to them and will be more important even than you. But if the dunya becomes your servant and it's in your hand and not in your heart, the dunya will for you be a speck in your eyes, and you won't be a speck in the eyes of ahlul dunya. So having good friends who have a proper relationship to the world and how they make money and how they spend it, understanding that it's a wasila, a means to an end and not an end in and of itself, is a very positive way of cultivating zuhud. So the most important takeaway from all of this, dear brothers and sisters, is to understand that zuhud is not in the external, looking a certain way. It is the state of the heart. And as the ulama say, if the person has lots of dunya in their hand but it's not in their heart, and they use it for the halal, then they are a zahid. Whereas a person who is wearing tattered clothes and disheveled hair is not necessarily a zahid if they are craving after the dunya in their heart. We can't get caught up in appearances. We have to look at the reality of what this is. And this is, I would say, this is the challenge of the age, because Muslims get pulled into this materialism. And one of the dangers is that if you are at level 3 materialism, then if you don't catch yourself at some point, it is feared that you may go to level 2 or even level 1, where you come to believe that the only thing that really matters is the material. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala warns us about that and speaks about those people. بَلْ تُؤْثِرُونَ الْحَيَاةَ الدُّنْيَا وَالْآخِرَةُ خَيْرٌ وَأَبْقَى. You prefer the life of the dunya, whereas the hereafter is better and longer lasting. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.